In the previous video, we examined two critical aspects of Ghamidi Sahab's critique: his interpretation of the inclusion of maternal siblings and the correct meaning of kalala stands in stark contrast to the traditional understanding held by the traditional scholars. In this presentation, we shall explore the third dimension of his critique. Ghamidi Sahab addresses the question: if Surah Al-Nisa, verse 12, is not referring to the maternal siblings of the deceased, but instead to the siblings of the nominated relatives, then who are the actual reference of Surah Al-Nisa, verse 176, used by the traditional scholars to determine the shares of full siblings? Furthermore, if the inheritance shares of siblings had already been outlined previously, why was there a need for another verse reiterating the same? It is also significant that the term kalala is used in both verses. Therefore, in order to understand verse 176 of Surah Al-Nisa, it is essential to translate and interpret it to ascertain whether the definition of kalala employed by Ghamidi Sahab in verse 12, derived through the verb yusa, is consistent with its usage in verse 176. Let us examine both interpretations of kalala as presented by the traditional scholars and by Ghamidi Sahab within the context of the verse and determine which interpretation is most coherent. The wording of the verse is as follows: we instruct you to proclaim that God gives you guidance concerning kalala. If a man dies without having any children but has a sister, she shall inherit half of what he leaves behind. Let us begin by substituting the traditional scholars' interpretation of kalala into this verse to comprehend their understanding. According to them, we have instructed you to proclaim that God is giving guidance about a deceased individual who has neither surviving parents nor progeny. If such a deceased person has no progeny but has a sister, she will inherit half of the estate. Let us analyze what this translation entails. A person who has no parents or progeny. If the deceased has no progeny. What does such a formulation imply? Any person familiar with linguistic expression would find this construction semantically incoherent. If kalala signifies a deceased individual without progeny and surviving parents, then why would the Quran proceed to explicitly elaborate in imru'un halaka laysa lahu walad, that is, if a man dies and has no progeny? To address this inconsistency, the traditional scholars posit that verse 176, specifically the phrase in imrun halaka laysa lahu waladun, is actually providing a definition for kala'ala. However, this position invites three major objections. The first objection is that if kala'ala was indeed an unfamiliar term to the primary audience, why would it be used at all in the Quran, a text repeatedly characterized as having been revealed in clear and accessible Arabic? Secondly, if God intended to define or emphasize this term, why was that definition deferred to verse 176 after more than 150 verses had already been revealed in the same surah? Finally, if kala'ala is to mean a person who has no progeny, then why does the definition omit any mention of the father? Hence, as per Ghamidi Sahab, we cannot accept an interpretation of kalala that renders the verse semantically void. The Quran does not permit such incoherent usage. Let us now interpret the verse with the alternative meaning of kalala as proposed by Ghamidi Sahab. Kalala refers to those relatives who exclude both progeny and father. The verse thus reads, we instruct you to proclaim that God gives you guidance regarding kalala relatives. If the deceased has no progeny but has one sister, she will inherit half of the estate. Now observe how the interpretation becomes lucid. The same sentence in Imrun halaka laysa lahu waladun, which earlier appeared incoherent under the traditional scholars' reading, becomes crystal clear with Ghamidi Sahab's rendering. The verse is now clearly about the deceased. But what is the real issue being discussed here? According to Ghamidi Sahab, the verse uses the definite article al in al-kalala, thereby specifying a particular category of relatives. In Arabic, the definite article serves to specify as in the book rather than a book. Thus, the reference is to particular relatives among all possible ones. Who are these relatives? As Ghamidi Sahab points out, the verse makes this self-evident. We instruct you to proclaim that God gives you guidance regarding kalala relatives. If the deceased has no progeny but has one sister, she receives half of the inheritance. If the sister dies without progeny, the brother is her heir. If there are two sisters, they receive 2/3. And if there are multiple siblings, the male receives the share of two females. God clarifies this for you so that you do not err. and God has knowledge of all things, the verse explicitly identifies the Kalala relatives under discussion as the siblings. According to Ghamdi Sahab, the beginning of Surah Al-Nisa addresses two main issues. Firstly, in the absence of progeny, but with the presence of siblings, the Quran limits the parental share to 1/3 of the estate. Secondly, the remaining share, ordinarily meant for children, is available to be distributed to nominated Kalala relatives. In such a situation, it could be conjectured that a testator might choose to leave the residual share to one brother, one sister, or any other relative. However, God does not permit this approach. Since the siblings after the progeny are the closest in kinship to the deceased, the inheritance must go to all of them. Hence, verse 176 of Surah Al-Nisa is a directive that, in the absence of children, siblings must inherit first. Traditional scholars extracted fixed shares for maternal and full siblings from these two verses. However, Ghamdi Sahab argues that these verses do not address this distinction at all. As a result, the attempt to derive different shares for maternal and full siblings proved fruitless. Let us now explore how Ghamdi Sahab, in light of the Quran, distributes inheritance in concrete cases. Case 2. A deceased woman is survived by her husband, mother, and two full sisters. According to Ghamdi Sahab, the total estate was rupees 12. Receives half due to absence of progeny. That amounts to rupees 6. The mother receives 1/6, rupees 2. The remaining balance is rupees 4. Verse 176 states that if there are two sisters, they receive 2/3 of the remaining amount. Thus, both sisters together receive 2/3 of 4 rupees, 2 rupees 66 paise. A minor residual amount remains. The Quranic principle governing such residual amounts offers 4 options. First, the deceased may stipulate in their will that this remaining share go to the sisters. Second, the deceased may allocate the share to another relative. Third, the deceased may assign it to a non-relative. Lastly, if no stipulation is made, the principle of akrabulakum nafran, as implemented by the Prophet, peace be upon him, comes into effect, and the balance goes to the nearest male relative. Thus, in this case, all heirs receive their entitled shares, and the distribution remains consistent with Quranic instruction. Let's come to case 3. The deceased woman is survived by her mother, 2 full sisters, and 2 maternal sisters. According to Ghamdi Sahab, in the presence of siblings, the mother receives 1/6 or 2 rupees of 12 rupees. The remaining 10 rupees is to be divided among all sisters, maternal or full, since the Quran makes no distinction here. The 2/3 share, rupees 6.66, is distributed among all 4 sisters equally. The remaining balance is handled according to the 4 previously mentioned principles. Throughout this series, we have identified not only the interpretive errors made by the traditional scholars in their understanding of Quranic inheritance law, but also the compounded errors that emerged while attempting to rectify the initial misreadings, errors that alarmingly alter the actual Quranic shares and even cast doubt upon the clarity of divine guidance. The interpretation held by the traditional scholars is not only invalidated by the text of the Quran, but also undermines the very purpose of divine legislation. According to their view, the final word of the Quran is insufficient. If true, this would open the door for alternative sources to override the divine decree, thereby claiming that the Quranic formulation is unworkable in practice. Worse still, their reliance on consensus to justify such positions implies that consensus itself can override divine words, which is a deeply problematic proposition. Ghamdi Sahab categorically rejects such consensus when it contradicts the manifest guidance of the Quran. In his view, it is inconceivable that the Quran would outline a law of inheritance that is practically inapplicable. Rather, the failure lies in our intellectual limitations that have prevented us from understanding the divine guidance as it truly is. This entire discussion serves as a case study for serious students of religion, illustrating how such grave misinterpretations could have been made by Muslim scholars in the first place, and how a consensus can emerge even around fundamental errors. Therefore, if even the Quran can be misinterpreted and altered under the cover of ijma', it becomes incumbent upon us to rigorously re-examine all other established doctrines of the traditional scholars in light of divine guidance,